The morning air on New Geneva Colony was crisp and cool when an explosion shook the ground beneath the small schoolhouse. Professor Lee Minho dropped his teaching tablet as the windows rattled, and 20 young faces turned toward him with wide, frightened eyes. "Stay calm, children," Minho said, though his own heart was racing. Through the classroom window, he could see smoke rising from the forest beyond the colony's perimeter. Something had crashed out there, something big. 8-year-old Park Ji-won raised her small hand. "Teacher, was that a meteor?" Before Minho could answer, the emergency beacon on his wrist began flashing red. First contact protocol. His breath caught in his throat. After 3 decades of space exploration, humanity had finally encountered another intelligent species. "Everyone line up by the door," he instructed, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're going to take a little walk outside." The children obeyed instantly, their chatter mixing excitement with nervousness. Kim So-young, one of his brightest 10-year-olds, tugged at his sleeve. "Are we going to see the crash site?" "We're going to be very careful and very quiet," Minho replied, leading them out into the colony's main courtyard. Other colonists were already gathering, pointing toward the smoke trail that marked where something had torn through the atmosphere and buried itself in the ground. Dr. Choi Hygiene, the colony's medical officer and part-time science teacher, jogged over with her emergency kit bouncing against her hip. "Readings show it's not radioactive," she called out, "but there are life signs, multiple life signs." The walk through the forest took 20 minutes, the children staying close together as they followed the path of destruction. Broken trees lay scattered like matchsticks, and the air smelled of burned metal and something else, something sweet and musical. When they reached the crash site, everyone stopped and stared. The ship was unlike anything in human design. It looked like it had been grown rather than built, with smooth curves that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns. Steam rose from cracks in its hull, and through those cracks came the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. It was like singing, but not quite, like music, but made of pure mathematics. The alien voices rose and fell in harmonies that seemed to follow rules a human ear could almost understand but not quite grasp. "My goodness," whispered Dr. Choi. "They're conscious. They're trying to communicate." A section of the ship's hull suddenly iris opened, moving like the pupil of an eye. From within, a figure emerged, and the children gasped as one. The alien was tall and graceful, its body made of what looked like living crystal. Fractal patterns danced beneath its translucent skin, shifting and changing like aurora in the night sky. It had 4 arms and legs that bent in ways human limbs never could, and its head was elongated, housing large eyes that reflected light like prisms. Behind the first alien came others. 2 adults and 3 smaller ones, obviously children by their size and the way they stayed close to the larger beings. All of them bore injuries, cracks in their crystal skin that leaked a fluid that glowed softly blue. The adult alien spoke, and the universal translator that every colonist wore sparked to life. The voice it produced was choppy and uncertain, struggling with concepts that didn't translate well. "We flee from the high ones above. Our small ones, they hunger for the forbidden, the sacred numbers." Young Lim Doon, barely 8 years old, stepped forward before any adult could stop her. She pulled a bandage from Dr. Choi's medical kit and gently approached the nearest alien child, whose arm showed a deep crack. "It's okay," she said softly. "We want to help." The alien child looked down at her, with eyes like liquid starlight. When Doon carefully applied the bandage, the alien's pattern shifted to warmer colors, and it made a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Sacred numbers?" asked Kim So-young, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "What are sacred numbers?" The adult alien gestured weakly toward the geometric patterns that covered their damaged ship. "The God speech, the language that shapes all things. Only the sky dwellers may know it. All others who seek such knowledge are..." The translator couldn't find a word, but the alien's patterns turned dark red, leaving no doubt about the fate of those who broke this law. Professor Minho felt his blood turn cold as understanding dawned. "Mathematics," he whispered. "They've been denied mathematics." Dr. Choi looked equally stunned. An entire species kept ignorant of basic mathematical principles. But why? The alien child that Dayun had bandaged was now staring at her tablet, which displayed simple addition problems from their interrupted lesson. Its patterns cycled rapidly through different colors, and it made excited musical sounds. "What is this?" it asked through the translator. "These symbols, they speak a quantity?" "It's just math," Dune said with a shrug. 2 plus 3 equals 5. See? The effect on the alien children was immediate and startling. All three of them crowded around the tablet, their patterns blazing with intense light. The adults behind them began to sing again, but this time the melody was different, sadder, more desperate. "For 3,000 rotations of our world," the adult alien said, "we have been told that such knowledge belongs only to the gods, that to learn it means death." Yoon Jae-min, 11 years old and never one to back down from injustice, crossed his arms and glared up at the towering alien. "Well, that's just stupid. Math belongs to everyone." As the human children began helping the injured aliens back toward the colony, none of them realized they had just taken the first step toward toppling a civilization that had ruled through ignorance for 3 millennia. The revolution would begin with arithmetic. The old storage shed behind the new Geneva schoolhouse had never seen so much excitement. 3 weeks after the crash, it had become the secret meeting place where human children gathered with their alien friends every evening after regular classes ended. Lim Daeun sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, carefully placing small stones in neat rows, while the young Kethmori watched with the intensity of scholars discovering fire. The alien children had names that sounded like musical notes when spoken aloud, but the humans had started calling them by simpler names they could pronounce. "This is Vel," Daeun said, pointing to the eldest alien child, whose crystalline body pulsed with soft blue light. "And this is Kira and Nal." The 2 smaller aliens chirped in response, their patterns shifting to warm yellow colors. "Now watch carefully." Daeun continued, moving the stones. 1 stone plus 1 stone makes 2 stones. 2 stones plus 1 more makes 3 stones. Vel's entire body lit up like a firework. "So quantities can be joined together?" "Of course they can," laughed Yoon Jae-min from the corner where he was drawing shapes in sand. "That's just the beginning. Look at this." He sketched a triangle and began explaining how its angles always added up to the same number. The alien children clustered around him, their patterns flickering rapidly as new concepts took root in their minds. Kim So-young had appointed herself the teacher of advanced concepts, even though she was only 10 years old. She held up her tablet, showing the aliens pictures of circles and squares. "Every shape follows rules," she explained. "Rules you can calculate and predict." The progress was frightening in its speed. Within days, the alien children had mastered basic arithmetic. Within 2 weeks, they were solving algebra problems that some human teenagers struggled with. Their minds, evolved for pattern recognition in their crystalline society, seemed perfectly designed for mathematical thinking. But it was during the 3rd week that everything changed. Park Ji-won was explaining physics concepts, using simple examples like dropping balls and rolling marbles. She showed them how gravity worked, how objects moved in predictable ways according to mathematical formulas. "The force equals mass times acceleration," she said, writing the equation in the sand. "Everything that moves follows this rule." Vel suddenly went very still, his patterns freezing in place. "Everything? Even the floating palaces of the high ones?" "Well, yeah," Ji-won said matter-of-factly. "If something floats, it's because other forces are pushing against gravity. Like this." She drew a diagram showing how hot air balloons worked, then moved on to more advanced concepts like magnetic levitation. The effect on the alien children was immediate. Their patterns blazed so brightly that the humans had to shield their eyes. Kira and Nal began singing in harmonies that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "You mean," Vel whispered, his voice barely audible to the translator, "the sky dwellers aren't really gods?" "They're just people who know science," Han Min Seo said with a shrug. She had joined the evening lessons after hearing about them from her classmates. Anyone can learn science if they want to. From the shadows near the shed door came a soft gasp. The human children turned to see several adult Kethmori standing there, their tall forms barely fitting through the doorway. They had been listening in secret, and now their patterns showed colors none of the humans had seen before. Elder Mordenvel's father stepped forward slowly. His crystalline form was dim compared to his son's brilliant display, showing his age and the weariness of someone who had worked hard labor his entire life without understanding why. "Young ones," he said carefully, "show me these calculations once more." Dune eagerly began the lesson again, this time with an audience of both children and adults. She showed them how to add and subtract, how to multiply and divide, simple concepts that the Keth Mori had been forbidden to learn for thousands of years. Morden watched his daughter Kira solve a problem that would have seemed like magic to him just moments before. His patterns shifted to deep purple, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with something that might have been anger or grief or both. 40 seasons I have built structures according to the sacred blueprints, he said, never knowing why the measurements mattered, never understanding what made a wall strong or weak. And now my daughter, in 3 weeks, knows more about construction than I learned in a lifetime. The other adult aliens murmured agreement, their songs creating a harmony of dawning realization. They began asking questions, wanting to understand everything at once. How did their tools work? Why did some materials behave differently than others? What made their crops grow better in certain arrangements? Professor Minho found them there an hour later, drawn by the sound of aliens singing. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. Human children teaching alien adults the fundamentals of mathematics and science, knowledge spreading like wildfire through a population that had been kept ignorant for millennia. "Professor," So Young called out excitedly, "we're showing them how to calculate building loads and crop yields. Did you know they've been doing everything by trial and error for thousands of years?" Minho felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what they had started. This wasn't just education anymore. They were giving an oppressed people the tools to understand their own oppression. And from the determined light in the aliens' crystalline faces, he could see they were planning to use that knowledge. The revolution had begun with addition and subtraction, but it was growing into something much larger. The secret was growing too big to hide. Word had spread to the Keth Mori refugee camp like water flowing downhill, and now adults who had lived their entire lives accepting the mysterious ways of their rulers gathered in small groups every evening, learning to count with the wonder of children discovering colors for the first time. Kim So-young had become the unofficial leader of what the human children jokingly called their math army. At 10 years old, she organized her classmates with the efficiency of a military commander. "Dune, you teach the beginners today. Jaemin, work with the geometry group. Minesio, take the physics students." The old storage shed was now too small for the growing number of students, so they had moved to the colony's community center after hours. Professor Minho had given up trying to stop the lessons and instead helped by providing more learning materials, though he watched the proceedings with growing worry. Vel had become something of a celebrity among his people. The young alien who had learned to solve calculus problems in just 6 weeks now stood before groups of adult Keth Mori, explaining concepts that their civilization had been denied for 3,000 years. "Watch carefully," Vel said, his patterns glowing bright white as he worked through a complex equation on the portable board Juwon had given him. "This formula tells us exactly how much power the floating cities need to stay in the air." The adult aliens leaned forward, their crystalline bodies reflecting Vel's light in rainbow cascades. Elder Thra, an old female who had spent her life tending gardens, raised one of her 4 arms. "How much power?" she asked through the translator. Vel's calculations filled the board. When he finished, the answer hung in the air like an accusation. "All of it," he said quietly. "Every bit of energy our planet produces goes to keeping the sky dwellers above us. They aren't sustained by divine will. They're stealing our power and making us believe it's magic." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Elder Morden struck the ground with his fist, creating a sound like breaking glass. 3,000 years, he said, his voice filled with barely controlled rage. 3,000 years of worship, and they were just thieves? "Not just thieves," added Kira, Vel's younger sister, who had become expert at engineering calculations. "They kept us stupid on purpose. If we had known these simple math rules, we could have built better homes, grown more food, created our own flying machines centuries ago." Han Min Seo, who had been quietly working with a group of Kethmori farmers, looked up from her tablet. Speaking of flying machines, I've been calculating the physics needed for the anti-grav generators. It's not that complicated once you understand the principles. The effect of her words was electric. Every alien in the room turned toward the 12-year-old human girl, who was casually discussing technology their rulers had claimed was beyond the understanding of mortals. "Show us," commanded Eldadra. Her patterns shifted to urgent red. Min Seo began drawing diagrams, explaining how magnetic fields could be manipulated to create lift, how power systems could be optimized for maximum efficiency. The concepts that seemed godlike from the ground were revealed to be simple applications of physics that any civilization should have discovered naturally. But it was Yoon Jae-min who made the discovery that changed everything. He had been working with a group of former construction workers, teaching them structural engineering, when he noticed something odd about the blueprints they had brought from their homeworld. "These building plans are deliberately bad," he announced during one evening session. "Look, if you change the support beam angles by just 15 degrees and use these mathematical ratios, the buildings will be twice as strong using half the materials." The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Not only had the ruling caste kept scientific knowledge from their people, they had actively given them inferior designs to ensure their structures would be weak and inefficient. "They wanted us to fail," whispered Elder Mordan. "They wanted our buildings to fall down, our crops to yield poorly, our tools to break quickly. It made us depend on them for everything." The mathematical lessons had revealed something far worse than ignorance. They had uncovered a systematic campaign of sabotage spanning millennia, designed to keep an entire species helpless and dependent. Park Ji-won, who had been unusually quiet during recent sessions, finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about something," she said in her small, clear voice. "If we can calculate how their anti-grav works, and we know how much power it needs, then we should be able to figure out how to turn it off." The room fell completely silent. Even the soft humming that Kethmori made when they were thinking stopped entirely. Vel's pattern cycled through every color in the spectrum before settling on a deep, determined blue. "You're talking about bringing down the floating cities." "I'm talking about making them land," G1 corrected, "so everyone can be equal. So no one has to live on the ground while others float in the sky like gods." Dr. Choi Hygiene, who had been documenting the lessons to the colony's records, looked up from her notes with alarm. "Children, what you're discussing sounds very much like revolution," finished So Young matter-of-factly. "We're planning a revolution using math." Professor Minho realized with growing horror that his students had accidentally become military strategists for an interplanetary uprising. The innocent desire to share knowledge had evolved into something that could topple governments and reshape entire civilizations. As the Kethmori began making plans to send mathematical knowledge back to their homeworld, Minho wondered if they had just lit a fuse that would burn across the stars. The decision came on a quiet Tuesday morning when Vel announced that the Kethmori refugees would return home. His crystalline form pulsed with determined light as he stood before the assembled humans and aliens in the colony's meeting hall. "We must take this knowledge to our people," he said, his translated voice carrying the weight of revolution. "Every day we stay here is another day that billions of our kind remain in darkness." Professor Minho felt his heart sink. He had grown fond of the alien family, and more importantly, he understood the danger they would face. "The ruling caste won't just let you teach mathematics freely. They'll try to stop you. Then we'll have to be smarter than them," replied Elder Mordan, his patterns shifting to confident gold. "And now, thanks to these young humans, we finally are." The Kethmori ship had been repaired over the past months, but not in the old way of following ancient procedures without understanding. Now every component had been rebuilt using engineering principles the aliens finally comprehended. The vessel hummed with new efficiency, its systems optimized by mathematical calculations rather than superstitious ritual. Kim So-young stepped forward, her young face serious beyond her years. "We want to come with you." The adults in the room began protesting immediately, but So-young held up her hand. "Listen to me. You're going to need teachers. People who can explain these concepts to others. We started this together, and we should finish it together." After hours of debate, a compromise was reached. A small group of volunteers would accompany the Kethmori: Professor Minho, Dr. Choi Hyjin, and three of the older students, So Young, Jaemin, and Min Seo. The younger children like Daeun and Ji-won would stay behind. Though their protests were loud and creative, the journey to the Kethmori homeworld took 2 weeks. During the voyage, the human volunteers got their first real look at the scale of oppression they were about to challenge. The ship's long-range sensors showed a planet covered with sprawling ground cities housing billions of Kethmori, while above them floated magnificent sky palaces that glittered like jewels against the stars. "How many people live down there?" asked Min Seo, studying the sensor readings. 15 billion in the ground settlements, Vel replied, his patterns dim with old sadness. "Maybe 50,000 in the sky cities. The entire population of our world divided into rulers and servants." Han Min Seo did quick calculations on her tablet. That's 300,000 people on the ground for every one person in the sky. And the ground dwellers do all the work. All of it, confirmed Kira. They grow the food, mine the materials, build everything. The sky dwellers claim they provide divine guidance, but really they just give orders. When they landed at a hidden site in the wilderness, the humans got their first close look at Kethmori civilization. The nearest ground city stretched for hundreds of kilometers, filled with buildings that were functional but crude, following the deliberately flawed designs that had kept the population dependent on their rulers. "It's like an entire civilization living in the Stone Age," whispered Yoon Jae-min as they made their way through underground tunnels to reach the city's edge. The tunnels were part of an existing network used by Kethmori, who worked dangerous jobs like mining and waste disposal. These workers had always been treated as the lowest class, but their hidden passages now provided the perfect way to move unseen beneath the city. Elder Thran, a tunnel worker who had learned mathematics from the encrypted messages sent ahead by the refugees, met them at a junction deep underground. His crystalline form was darker and more scarred than the aliens they had known, marked by years of hard labor in dangerous conditions. "The knowledge spreads like fire through dry grass," he told them, his patterns flickering with excitement. "We have teaching groups in 12 districts now. Workers who spent their lives following orders without understanding are suddenly seeing the patterns behind everything." The humans were taken to a hidden chamber far below the city, where dozens of adult Kethmori sat in circles, working through basic mathematics with a concentration of people whose lives depended on it. Because, Vel had explained, their lives did depend on it. "Every equation they learn is a piece of the cage that breaks away," he said. "When they understand how their tools really work, how their buildings are designed to fail, how the sky cities stay aloft, they see the truth about their entire world." Professor Minho watched a group of construction workers learning to calculate proper load-bearing ratios for the first time in their lives. These aliens had built cities with their own hands, but never understood why some structures stood while others fell. Now, they were seeing the mathematical principles that had been hidden from them. "How long before everyone knows?" asked Dr. Choi. "Knowledge doubles every 3 days," replied Thran. "Each person who learns becomes a teacher for others. We estimate that within 2 months, every Kethmori in this city will understand basic mathematics." So Young looked up from where she was helping a group of young adults work through geometry problems. "And when everyone knows math, what happens to the people who kept it secret?" The chamber fell quiet, except for the soft humming that Kethmori made when thinking. Finally, Elder Thran spoke, his patterns cycling through colors that had no names in human language. "When everyone knows the truth," he said slowly, "the lies that hold up their sky palaces will no longer be enough." The revolution was spreading through underground tunnels and hidden chambers, carried by simple addition problems and basic physics equations. Soon it would reach the surface. The revolution began with a single number broadcast across the planet at exactly midday. Vel stood in the underground communication center, his crystalline form blazing with light as he transmitted one simple calculation to every Kethmori settlement on the world. The message was brief. Power required to keep one sky palace floating, 847,000 energy units per day. Total power produced by our entire planet, 847,000 energy units per day. Within minutes, 15 billion Kethmori understood the truth that had been hidden from them for 3 millennia. Their gods were not divine beings sustained by cosmic forces. They were parasites consuming every drop of energy their planet produced while keeping their hosts ignorant of basic mathematics. In the hidden chamber deep beneath the ground city, Kim So-young watched the communication screens light up with responses from settlements across the world. Each message contained the same realization, expressed in the musical language of an awakening species. "It's working," she whispered to Professor Minho. "They're all learning at once." But the ruling caste was not blind to the changes happening below. High above in the floating palaces, alarms began sounding as monitoring systems detected unusual patterns in the behavior of the ground dwellers. Agricultural output had increased by 30%. Construction projects were finishing ahead of schedule. Most disturbing of all, some settlements had stopped sending their full energy quotas upward. The sky dwellers' response was swift and brutal. Armed enforcement vessels descended from the floating cities, heading for settlements where the mathematical knowledge had spread fastest. Their mission was simple: eliminate the source of the problem before it could spread further. They had not counted on facing an enemy who understood physics. Yoon Jae-min stood with a group of Kethmori engineers in a hidden valley, watching the enforcement ships approach through calculated flight patterns. The aliens had learned to predict exactly where the ships would be at any given moment, and more importantly, they had learned what would happen when projectiles met those ships at precisely the right angle. "Trajectory calculations complete," announced Elder Thran, his scarred form steady as he prepared the first of the siege engines they had built using principles learned from human children. "Firing angle: 43 degrees, elevation adjusted for wind resistance." The projectile that struck the lead enforcement ship was not particularly sophisticated. It was simply a large rock launched at exactly the right speed, angle, and timing to intersect with a moving target whose path had been mathematically predicted. The ship's shields, designed to deflect random debris, could not handle a deliberate strike calculated to exploit their specific weaknesses. Han Min-seo, monitoring the battle from the communication center, felt her stomach turn as the ship crashed to the ground. "This is really happening," she said quietly. "We're actually fighting a war using math homework." But this was not a war of destruction. As the enforcement ships fell from the sky, teams of Kethmori rushed to help the survivors. They had not come to kill their oppressors, but to liberate them from the lies that had imprisoned both rulers and ruled for thousands of years. The most brilliant part of the revolution was not military, but mathematical. Working together, the human children and their alien students had calculated the exact frequency needed to disrupt the anti-grav generators that kept the sky palaces floating. They did not want to crash the floating cities and kill everyone aboard. They wanted to bring them down safely and end the artificial separation between sky and ground forever. Park Ji-won, who had started this entire revolution by explaining basic physics to injured refugees, now watched from the main observation deck as her calculations were put to the ultimate test. Across the planet, hidden transmitters began broadcasting precise electromagnetic frequency that would cause the anti-grav systems to gradually lose power. The floating palaces began to descend slowly, like balloons losing air. For the first time in 3,000 years, the sky dwellers found themselves on the same level as everyone else. The revolution succeeded not because the ground dwellers had become better at violence, but because they had become better at understanding. Within days, the artificial technological gap that had maintained the social hierarchy simply disappeared. Former rulers who had claimed divine knowledge found themselves competing as equals with people who had recently learned to add and subtract. Professor Minho stood in what had once been the most exclusive sky palace, now resting peacefully on the ground with his doors thrown open to anyone who wished to enter. The halls that had once echoed with the voices of those who claimed to be gods now buzzed with the sound of mathematics being taught to everyone. Elder Morden, the construction worker who had lived 40 years without understanding why buildings stood or fell, now worked side by side with the former sky dwellers, teaching them the practical applications of the theories they had hoarded. The irony was not lost on anyone that the people who had claimed to possess all knowledge needed to learn basic engineering from those they had oppressed. Vel found the humans in the palace's former throne room, which had been converted into a classroom where Kethmori children of all backgrounds learned mathematics together. "This is our gift to your people," he said, presenting them with a crystalline tablet covered in equations. The formula for faster-than-light travel, developed by minds at Learn Edition only 6 months ago. Kim So-young accepted the tablet with hands that shook slightly. Knowledge really does create more knowledge, she said. As the human delegation prepared to return home, they left behind a world transformed. The revolution that had begun with counting stones in a storage shed had toppled an empire and freed 15 billion minds from ignorance. Sometimes the greatest weapons against tyranny were multiplication tables and the willingness to share them with anyone who wanted to learn.